My name is Brian Fonseca. I'm director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. It's truly an honor to welcome you back to day 5, the final day of FIU's annual Hemispheric Security Conference. It's been an amazing program so far, and we've had incredible speakers talk about some of the most prevailing issues facing the region. Today, we're going to dive deep into security in Central America and the Caribbean. And we have a stellar cast once again to kind of walk us through some of the more prevailing issues facing two vital regions, of course, to our hemisphere. Before we do that, I want to give a shout out to another shout out to our collaborators, U.S. Southern Command, the OAS, the Perry Center, Council of the Americas, the Carter Center, the Wilson Center, the Global Health Consortium, and FIU's Robert Stemple College of Public Health and Social Work, CREES, and Universidad Nacional de La Plata in Argentina. Amazing collaborators and really truly a testament to this being a hemispheric-wide program, something that we set out to do, and I think we've achieved this year. It's now my privilege, my honor, to introduce a very close friend, Randy Pestana. Randy is the assistant director at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and for all intents and purposes, even though I am the director, I know I work for Randy on most occasions. But Randy is a stellar individual with tremendous experience in the region. He's got some excellent work that he's done on Central America. In fact, he and I have authored some stuff relative to security situation in Honduras. He's also done some work on the citizenship by investment programs in the Caribbean. And he's got a tremendous wealth of knowledge in some of these vital areas that I suspect we're going to talk about today. So with that, Randy, I kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm extremely excited to bookend this end of the conference with an important discussion on the security situation facing the Caribbean and Central America. And today, I couldn't think of a better panel to bring together to discuss it. So I will briefly introduce them in order. And they will go for about 5 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll get right into a discussion. So speaking first is Major Richard Lynch from Trinidad and Tobago. He is Deputy Director of International Affairs Unit at the Ministry of National Security. Here, he advises the Ministry of National Security on matters requiring international cooperation, working closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CARICOM. Just for note, he is not speaking today on behalf of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Speaking second, you all know her down here. She is probably the authority on the Haiti and the English-speaking Caribbean. Jacqueline Charles, she is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and Emmy Award-winning foreign correspondent with the Miami Herald. You can follow her work at Twitter on at Jackie Charles. Third is Juan Gonzalez, who is currently a senior fellow at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. He spent 16 years in the U.S. government, including the State Department, the National Security Council, and the Office of the Vice President. He last served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, where he led diplomatic engagement with Central America and the Caribbean. And finally, and certainly not least, is Dr. Jennie Lincoln, who manages the Carter Center's projects in Latin America and staffs former President Jimmy Carter's activities in the region. She is also a professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, where she teaches Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. So as you see, we have a robust panel, and I'm excited to get it kicked off. So let's start first with you, Richard.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this series of sessions on hemispheric defense and security. Thank you to Brian and Randy in that regard. I want to piggyback on something that Admiral Fowler said at the beginning of the conference. He analogized the Caribbean and the hemisphere as a neighborhood netted together by democratic principles and values. But as in any neighborhood, there is some measure of commonality, but there are also differences. And the Caribbean is no different. We are an important part of the hemispheric neighborhood, but with some unique descriptions and prescriptions as it pertains to defense and security. So in this regard, I would want to outline from the start. I mean, we are a zone of peace. We have had a long history of peaceful transitions generally of political power. We are young institutions. We are essentially island states with a few exceptions. And particularly for us, the question of tourist-based economies are dominant structures of our economies across the region, with a particular emphasis on dependency on the environment. that geographic, geoeconomic, and geopolitical framework segues into what I consider the three salient descriptive pillars of defense and security in the Caribbean. The first being transnational organized crime, secondly, climate change, and thirdly, and most contemporarily, the issue of this global pandemic called COVID-19 or coronavirus. Transnational organized crime for the Caribbean has placed us situational in the middle of a global supply chain, where producing regions of the north and consuming regions of the hemispheric and transatlantic north. And as a result of this, our young institutions are placed in a context of defense and security that requires a collaborative framework way beyond the geographical confines of the Caribbean. And the impact of the movement of drugs, of narcotics, in its various forms, arms and ammunition, have significantly impacted upon the quality of lives of people across the Caribbean societies. In that regard, the second salient descriptive pillar of Caribbean defense and security, that of climate change, has already begun to demonstrate currently and certainly futuristically some challenges for us in terms of our defense and security landscape. The global agenda, for instance, of global average warming at 2%, the science tells us that we in the Caribbean, for our own survivability, need to be able to locate a global average warming at around 1.5%. And again, it's tied to our huge dependency on our environment as an important part of our survivability. Two classic examples of that would have been the Hurricane Maria in 2017. And in just 5 hours, the island of Dominica lost 227% of its GDP in 5 hours. That's a significant impact. The island of Barbuda had to be totally evacuated. But the question of climate refugees is not new to the region. Way back in 1995, a volcano erupted in the island of Montserrat that resulted in the evacuation of the entire populations. So climate change is going to be a future and certainly current challenge for us and the vulnerabilities that are associated with it. And lastly, and more contemporarily, the question of this global pandemic called COVID-19. I'm not happy to report that we have only lost 84 lives of the 20 nations that we've looked at in the region, particularly because those 84 lives were very important, not just to the families, but to the global humanity as a family as a whole. But in the context of the way we approach COVID-19 going forward, we are going to have to consider significantly how our tourist-based economies and the fact that the very livelihood and survivability of Caribbean society is based on travel. No one is going to attempt to jump on a plane or let alone a cruise ship in the foreseeable future, so that the tourist sector and its impact on the economy has a particular impact for us, relationship with COVID-19. So I want to conclude in my introductory remarks by outlining that the defense and security landscape for the Caribbean and certainly the hemispheric neighborhood is going to have to consider the unique construct in which those three salient descriptive pillars of Caribbean defense and security are related to each other. And I will close at this point and I wait for further questions in the Q&A. I thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Great remarks, and I completely agree. We definitely need to look at energy and pandemics. Obviously, we had a great panel on Wednesday looking at pandemics for the conference. Now we'll turn over to Jackie Charles.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to piggyback on a lot of what Richard has said, because these are some of the same issues that I'm seeing as a reporter who cover the region. In terms of some of the security issues, we're going to have some of the traditional ones, such as drug trafficking, while Mexico and Central America remain the popular routes. What DEA officials are seeing is that drugs are being moved through the region. Routes that were popular in the 80s are once again becoming popular, and especially Puerto Rico and USVI. We've seen a decriminalization effort in a number of countries, starting with Jamaica, which in 2016 started to provide for medical marijuana, but at the same time, it remains a huge supplier of marijuana to other countries in the Caribbean. And the question is whether or not these efforts that we're seeing by other countries, will it be enough? experts say no, because the demand for illegal substances remains high in the United States and also in Europe. COVID-19, when we started talking about this conference, COVID-19 was still in China. But today it very much is a part of the reality in the Caribbean, and it is having a huge impact. Likely at the end of this year, it will lead to serious economic consequences, which we are starting to see. And there are increasing fears in many of these countries that there will be an increase in crime and violence as a result of the loss of jobs and the loss of economic activities, especially due to tourism. Scams and cybersecurity. Scams and cybercrime. Last year, when I traveled with Admiral Fuller to Jamaica and the Dominican Republic and Haiti, this issue was very much at the forefront of the agenda when he met with the Jamaica Defense Force. They are focusing on this. Jamaica, we're no stranger to the whole lottery scams. They are starting to also see crimes involving cybercrime, and they're taking this seriously. Terrorism, it will likely remain on the regional security agenda. We all know about the relationship in terms of ISIS, the Islamic State in Trinidad and Tobago. For CARICOM, this continues to be a concern, as well as the fact that a number of countries in our region provide passports, citizenship by investment. It remains a controversial topic, and it's something that needs to continue to be watched because of weaknesses in the ability to do background checks, and also with the ease of travel through the region. The other thing, the collapse of the government, will create a greater refugee crisis. And we're talking about the Venezuelan government. Everybody's concerned about this. Colombia, Trinidad, Guyana. I mean, for them, they're saying that if you end up having thousands of Venezuelan migrants on the border, this will be a game changer in terms of the COVID-19 response. How do you address that? And there are issues that are being raised with Venezuela, especially in terms of the testing. And can we really trust the numbers that they are providing? Also, in the same context of migration and COVID, we have to look at Haiti. Today the cases are rising. Haiti got a late start to this. March 19 was their first case. And even though the Dominican Republic next door is over 11,000 infections and almost 500 deaths, the numbers are going up in Haiti. It's a weak health system. And we have an issue of a government that's already in a crisis. And if people start to get on boats, this is going to spell trouble for the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and the United States. So this is something that seriously needs to be looked at, thought about, and what is the regional response? And then finally, we'll add in there the growing COVID crisis in Brazil. When you look at COVID and what's happening, the reality is while some of us are acting each man, woman, child for himself, or each country for themselves, if one country in this region is not able to flatten that curve, all of us remains in danger, because the reality is our borders are open. They may be temporarily closed right now, but they are open, and we have people moving back and forth. So how do you protect your country? How do you protect the numbers? And that is something that countries have not figured out, even as they put in dates and says, we're reopening our borders starting June 1st. And I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Jackie. Certainly something we're all really thinking about. Juan, if I could turn to you.
Thanks, Randy, and Richard and Jacqueline. Thank you for providing an excellent context for our conversation today. I think what I would do is first add maybe one or two themes to what Richard laid out, and then talk about maybe what's coming. What I think a lot of analysts see as coming over the next year, 5 years, or 10 years in terms of security. So I think Richard provided an excellent frame here on disaster preparedness, climate change, the pandemic preparedness as being a way to a need to start reframing how we view security issues. Traditionally, we've been very stovepiped on either drugs, migration, or potential criminal actors or terrorist threats. I would add to this as well issues of cybersecurity as something that needs to be seriously considered, and then maybe something provocative, thinking about the role of external actors like Russia in corroding the institutions in Central America and the Caribbean. It's something that has been happening for a while, and it's going to continue to aggravate the security situation in the region. The commentary I want to make is that the global pandemic here has really laid bare the weaknesses in all of Latin America's development model. It's a region that well before the coronavirus was suffering from a crisis of representation, of governance, and of accountability, and where questions of the lack of political, social, and human rights have been at the forefront of U.S. policy. That's the perspective I take to these issues, and what the pandemic has done is aggravated some of these challenges in a very major way. Furthermore, I think when we talk about when the U.S. government, when I was in the White House, we talked about the growing middle class. What we didn't maybe understand at the time or speak to was that the growing middle class and prosperity in the region is incredibly fragile, where people are working 2 jobs or they are just barely in the middle class, and any sort of change, be it through a natural disaster or any sort of economic impact, has brings communities back into abject poverty. So how to tackle these challenges and the trends ahead. When I look at the trends ahead in the 2.5 minutes I have left, the pandemic here is accelerating a series of changes that are going to be happening in the region in 10 or 15 years, that if there isn't a new paradigm of cooperation where the countries, I would say, of North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico, but North America also thinking about Central America, the Caribbean, Colombia, and Venezuela are actually working together to address some of these challenges. Over the next 15 years, we're going to be in a very, very dire situation. What I mean by that is we have major demographic change taking place that if you look at the GDP growth of Latin America over the last 15 years has been largely a function of population growth. So no policies that these governments have undertaken. So what happens when that demographic dividend goes away? You see that Guyana is about to reap a windfall from petroleum extraction, but the world is going through an energy transition, and economies in throughout the hemisphere remain incredibly dependent on commodities. And of course, climate change as being a factor that's going to impact the economies and the security of the region. And then automation is something that's going to have a devastating effect on the labor forces of Latin America. What does that mean for security? In my last minute, what I would say is that what has happened is first, I think the pandemic has in some ways provided a cover for certain leaders, and I would pick on El Salvador's president Bukele to further undermine some of these rights. And I was very heartened to hear that the United Nations has really called for, and I'm sure President Bachelet had mentioned this, but requiring that the emergency response here is something that is legal, proportional, and necessary. So now is not the time to do away with rights; it's to reaffirm and double down on the rights and institutions that will help us overcome these sort of crises. The second point is our institutions today are not equipped to handle these broader challenges. You look at SICA as a very ineffective organization. CARICOM and its related security bodies are spread out throughout the Caribbean in a way that makes it difficult to cooperate more actively with the international community. And I lived this firsthand when I was in the State Department. And then, of course, there's a lack of political will. In many cases, some of the reforms necessary in places like Central America are ones that go completely against the political interests of the political class. And then economically, the economic elites in these countries really prefer a status quo where government does not have a role, and you are actually exporting some of your social problems and receiving remittances as a way to really drive economic prosperity for a very, very precious few. So I'm happy to enter into discussions on kind of the traditional threats and how these changes impact the roles of criminal groups. But I wanted to add on an excellent framing provided by Richard and Jacqueline. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Turn it over to Jennie.
The roles of criminal groups, and I wanted to add on an excellent framing provided by Richard.
Hello, Jennie, can you hear us? Can we turn it over to you?
Randy, am I on? Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for the invitation. And these introductory remarks put me in the position of cleanup batter on a baseball team. And the framework that's been provided is fascinating for us to think not only in terms of the COVID crisis right now, but as Juan was talking about, looking into the future. I want to use as a case study for a moment to look at Nicaragua, which is a little bit different in the hemisphere right now. And when we, as Jacqueline said, when we started looking at this conference, it was before the COVID crisis had hit so hard in the United States and the hemisphere. And democracy was suffering even then and has in Nicaragua for the past couple of years. When I thought about this, I thought Nicaragua is a country with a history of authoritarian dictatorships and a fragmented opposition that has struggled for democracy. Nothing has changed. There was a brief respite with 1990 when Doña Violeta beat Daniel Ortega in a free and fair election, and democracy flourished, the economy improved, and then Daniel Ortega was elected again and elected in 2006. And from 2007 to 2018, and I use 2018 April as a benchmark there, the country emerged economically, but also there was a trend toward authoritarian control again, which then with the crisis of 2018 put us back to a bipolar Nicaragua with two forces, authoritarian forces and a fragmented, struggling opposition to fight those forces. The seeds of dictatorship now have Nicaragua facing several conditions. One, a repressive government. Yesterday, the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet from the United Nations, mentioned that there are 86 political prisoners in Nicaragua right now. The abuse of human rights, it means that the government has held off the United Nations scrutiny, the OAS scrutiny, and the abuses are numerous. The army and the police, and now sort of the Venezuelan type extra police are operating in Nicaragua to control the people. The economic conditions have plummeted. Last year, a drop of over 3% is projected to go over 5% drop in GDP this year. The social controls of the Sandinista government, ironically, have failed to protect the country from the COVID. And actually, the COVID policy of Nicaragua is different in this hemisphere. It's open. They haven't closed their borders, they haven't clocked down, and they haven't been transparent at all about reporting cases. So Jacqueline's comment just struck me about what happens in one country affects the others. And that's certainly the case in Nicaragua with the impact of a no COVID policy in Nicaragua. That means the pandemic is spreading. People don't know there, and they certainly are not aware or not prepared for what the actual cases and deaths may be. There are even now the government is doing express burials, burying people who have died from some kind of disease that is not identified as COVID. So the government also is not cooperating with international organizations, and not with the human rights the organizations nor the Organization of American States. So I would add that to Juan's list of concerns about dismissing the international standards and the international covenants in the region. This brings us to Nicaragua's democracy 17 months out of an election that is under the same, basically, if it were held now, it would be under the same conditions that were the ones that were protested 2 years ago in the crisis. There has been no respect of the Organization of American States agreement with the government of Nicaragua for political reform, for electoral reform. The efforts of Secretary General have been dismissed. The opposition's attempts at uniting are fragile. They are trying, but there is the fragmentation remains, and there is no sign of any kind of negotiation with the government that could produce any kind of political or electoral reform before an election possibly to be held as scheduled in November of 2021. The response to the pandemic has been secretive, it's not transparent. The government just last week multiplied its cases reported by 10 to get to only 200 and 250, something like that. And so the citizens have produced a citizen observatory to try to track cases on their own, just by family reporting and hospital reportings and case reportings. And they're reporting up to almost 2,000 cases where the government has just reported a few. So we really have a tale of two Nicaraguas, an oppressive government that is ignoring or dismissing the COVID as a bad case of the flu or cold, and an opposition that is trying to rally both politically and with health interests to try to pull the curtain back on the government reporting about the COVID pandemic and the impact. It has impacted the neighbor, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is now testing the fevers of truck drivers. And so commerce is now disrupted across the borders. So these are a few of the thoughts for Nicaragua and in the impact of COVID on democracy in the region. And these are things that we can throw out on the table for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. So I want to go into it quickly, and then we'll move away from it. Certainly, COVID is impacting the region heavily now. So, but I want to look at the economics of this a little bit. So, Richard, thinking about a country like Trinidad and Tobago, and then another country like Guyana, who is doing oil exploration. How much is it impacting your economy, not just in the tourism sector, but looking at the oil production and the cost of oil globally and how that's impacting Trinity and the Caribbean at large?
Political economies in the region. The fact of the matter is you have two economies, energy-based economies in the Caribbean community, as you mentioned, Trinidad and Tobago and certainly Guyana. And with the fall in oil prices, the fact is Trinidad and Tobago has experienced two recessions essentially before this, in the early 1980s, and certainly during the 2006-2008 global financial crisis. But in both instances, the immediate rise in oil prices gave us an opportunity to be able to successfully negotiate and navigate our way through the recessions. Given the dynamics centered around the price of energy, global energy prices, we do not foresee a rise in energy prices in the foreseeable future to be able to give us the kind of buoyancy that we need to be able to navigate our way through the COVID-19 crisis, as was the case in the past. So what we are quite sure about is that the economic recovery pathway for Trinidad and Tobago and certainly Guyana in this instance is going to be slow growth. It's going to be slower than the ways we have recovered in the past. Now, what is encouraging in the midst of this is that there has been some levels of economic diversification. Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, has a quite robust manufacturing sector that serves throughout the Caribbean. And those are the sectors that we are going to have to take significant consideration and investment in to be able to mitigate against the low prices of oil in relation to being able to ensure that we are able to build an economy post COVID-19. But essentially, we are going to have to create a roadmap to which we are currently pursuing to ensure that we can navigate through certainly the sustained lower energy prices that we intend to experience going forward.
Thank you, Richard. I want to turn to Juan here because I know when you were in government, you led an effort into the Caribbean to help diversify energy resources and support the development of alternative to traditional fossil fuels and oil. Can you talk a little bit about that and your thoughts?
Sure. So I think that when academics are writing the postmortem on the pandemic, you'll see a division of the economic crises the region has suffered. You had the debt crisis after the collapse of import substitution and industrialization. You had the currency and banking crisis, the lasting banking crises of the 90s and the 2000s. And I think what is going to be seen is in the after action for this particular period is going to be the pandemic and energy value destruction impact. So you're going to see, and you've seen even in the United States, the talk about how the pandemic is going to have likely a lasting economic impact on businesses. But on energy, it is going to be something that even after a slow recovery, it's going to take a very long time to come back from that. But I see that as an opportunity. And when I was talking about paradigm shift and how the United States and North America views its responsibilities to Central America and the Caribbean, there's perhaps no other region near the United States that has more impact on our security and prosperity than what happens in the Caribbean and Central America. So the idea of a hegemonic presumption where the United States should be, I would say, it's easy for me to say this because I'm out of government, investing as much as it did in Afghanistan into Central America and the Caribbean will be necessary to overcome the devastating damage of this crisis and to avoid the second and third order effects, migration, criminality, all that. The Caribbean Energy Security Initiative was an idea that the vice president had, where he saw that the decline of Petrocaribe was having an economic impact on the region, and that it was in the interest of the United States to marshal the international community to address the main challenges to the Caribbean when it came to energy security. And one of those was energy governance. So you had interests that did not see change, the need for change in their own economic interests. You had this high cost of borrowing and something that made it very difficult to innovate. And then you had a dependence on very expensive and heavily an expensive diesel as the main energy mix. The approach that we took was trying to find an all of the above approach to energy transition, as opposed to an ideological approach where either you go fossil fuels or you go renewables. What we said was, look, geothermal was a solution for some, natural gas was a good transition fuel for others, solar was another transition for others, and that we needed to support that all of the above approach to facilitate a transition. I would argue that now for the Caribbean and frankly Central America, we need again a very large, and I hate to use this overused word, Marshall Plan, to ensure that the Caribbean is preparing not just for the global energy transition, but to overcome the damaging impacts of the coronavirus and of course preparing for adaptation to the economic and social and political dislocations that are going to be created by climate change.
Thanks, Juan. A brief follow-up here, though. I know it's very difficult to bring and harmonize the governments across the Caribbean. That seems to be a challenge. How do you help each other harmonize governance towards renewables or other forms of energy?
Again, I mean, from a U.S. policy perspective, what I would say is first is the U.S. government is still very much stovepiped. I think the way that we've organized our presence on security and first of all, but also on other issues is still harkens back to kind of the cocaine cowboy days when we had a very significant opt-out presence in the Bahamas. A lot of those resources have shifted to Central America, chasing the drug flows. The United States, first of all, needs to take a step back and say, what are our security interests in the region? And how are we having this conversation, a real conversation with Mexico and Canada to help facilitate this? I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. Second of all, this needs to be something that needs to be driven at the leader level. The best way I've experienced, and I don't want to be presumptuous, Richard knows this much better than I do, is if you want to move the Caribbean, you have to engage at a leader level with CARICOM. That's how it has to happen. Because if you're working at lower levels of government, the things move so much more slowly. And I got to tell you that Caribbean countries are incredibly important to the United States. They've had amazing cultural, social influence, and they are very close to us, that we should be engaging at a very senior level, given all the interest that we have in advancing. And so, any president, whether Donald Trump is reelected or Joe Biden is elected, in January, one of the things that should happen, this is my personal view, is very early on, there should be a very serious and concrete results-driven discussion between the United States at a leader level with the Caribbean on trying to address the impacts and obviously the energy price destruction that's taking place. And I would say, sorry, final point, Randy, is look at, when we saw that, after the collapse of import substitution and industrialization, you had these innovations. You had the Brady plan to try to address debt flows. You had the development of the Washington Consensus, and you can decide whether or not that was. I think now is the time for us to really break glass on ideas that maybe seemed out of reach to address the situation in particularly in the Caribbean and Central America. Thank you.
I want to turn to Jacqueline on this topic, particularly looking at Guyana. Obviously, Guyana's had a questionable election, to say the least. Jennie knows this very well. Carter Center was not invited back, and the U.S. has pressed Guyana as well. But they're doing oil explorations and starting to push towards that. But if you could touch on that, but also look at the impact of tourism broadly across the Caribbean. Most Caribbean countries are heavily dependent upon tourism dollars for their economic livelihoods, and that's being impacted by COVID. So if you can talk about those items, Jacqueline.
Sure, and just to piggyback off of what Juan was saying, I think one of the issues that we have to look at in the Caribbean, the elephant in the room, it's Venezuela. When you look at the oil deal that these Caribbean countries got from Venezuela, it was very advantageous to them because it was buy now, pay later. And as you mentioned, these are countries that are already heavily indebted. And so what the United States was offering them, from their perspective, was not the same as what Venezuela was offering. And that it was just basically either going to benefit big corporations or get them deeper into debt. So I think that if the US really wants to address this energy crisis in the Caribbean, it's going to have to try to find a way to somewhere meet in the middle, because what's happening, what we're seeing as a result of the US policy on Venezuela and what's happening in Venezuela, you don't have those Petro-Caribe inflows coming in anymore. They're starting to impact various countries. In Haiti, we had 3 lockdowns of the entire country last year, and they were rooted in the political crisis, but also in terms of the oil issue and the pressure on Haiti to switch sides. That said, when CARICOM started to see the end in terms of Venezuela, there were discussions in reference to Trinidad, but Trinidad did not want to be the new Venezuela. They didn't want to be in a situation where all of a sudden 14 countries owe them and they can't get paid. So it's like, I'm going to stick with the US because I know when I sell my natural gas to them, I'm going to get my check, in the mail. The question with Guyana today, once they get past this crisis with the elections, is Guyana willing to step into that role and to assist its fellow CARICOM member states in finding a way to get fuel? We hear a lot of talking, but we don't really see this push to do alternative energy. And finally, on the tourism issue, look, the biggest impact of this COVID crisis has been on tourism. Let's just take, a country like Jamaica. Last year, Jamaica had $3.7 billion just from tourism. More than 50% of its foreign exchange is tied to tourism. When I recently spoke with the tourism minister, he says, he got the latest report, hotels, 0. For passengers coming in, 0. Number of revenue from tourism, 0. 20 of the world's most tourism dependent economies, of the 20, 13 of them are in the Caribbean region. And we've seen reports from St. Lucia saying they're going to reopen their airports to U.S. Tourists only. The U.S. Virgin Islands is saying that they're going to open around June 1st. Antigua's talking about reopen. They're all talking about these immunity passports, and you have to get a test in order to come in. It's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out. But nobody in the Caribbean right now has presented a plan to say, here's how we're going to balance lives and livelihoods by reopening our economy to tourists.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Richard, you raised your hand. You wanted to jump in here. So you're on mute, Richard.
Yeah, Randy, I could not agree with Jacqueline anymore. The fact of the matter is we are going to have to pursue a significant balancing act between the way we reopen our economies, but we ensure the safety and security of persons who get back out to work. And that to me, because the fact of the matter is there are some economies that cannot afford to take a physical and social distancing approach at the expense of the crashing of one's economy. And that balance, to me, requires a level of leadership at the national and certainly regional level and perhaps interregional levels. Because as Jackie outlined, you have to pay for security. Security comes at a cost. And the cost of security has to be tied to the very nature of the economies of countries in the Caribbean. And this introduces the notion of vulnerability. What do we mean by vulnerability beyond the Westphalian model of territorial security and the idea that we could regulate the movement of persons in and out of our territorial waters? The complexity of our security reality means that we need to move beyond the traditional Westphalian ideas of security and leverage some broader multidimensional understandings of who we are as a people and what our interests are. My last point in that regard is a comment was made earlier about cybersecurity, but the question of cybersecurity at the state level has to be placed in the context of leveraging information as a national asset that needs to be defended and or secured. The challenge with that is migrating into that conceptual framework of defense and security requires that we establish what is the nature of sovereignty in the cyber world. And that moves us away from our traditional understandings of sovereignty, but places us square in the context of an appropriate ways of approaching defense and security moving forward.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that's a great insight into how we do this. I do want to talk about a key issue that goes through all of this, and we've seen a decline in recent years in terms of democracy in the region, right? Jennie, you work with the Carter Center. You do a lot of efforts in the region to ensure democratic principles are upheld, but we're seeing a number of cases like Guyana, Haiti, Central America, looking at Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, right? What is the state of democracy in this region, and how is that affecting security?
Well, Randy, democracy was suffering before COVID in the region with corruption, with difficulty with the rule of law, with fragile institutions, with the emergence of dictatorial tendencies in elected presidents and in the legislatures. Every one of the countries in Central America, perhaps I should excuse Costa Rica, but Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador have all had questionable response to recent elections, where a very popular president in El Salvador seemingly then took on the mantle of basically dictatorial authoritarianism, and despite having been so popularly elected, the response of there are two steps here. One is to consider democracy and the institutions in the hemisphere and the responsibilities for Democrats and democratic governments. And the second is to consider the conditions under which these Democrats and democratic governments are being asked to govern now, given the conditions that we just heard with other speakers talking about the economic situations and now the added security threat of health. And if there is the health of a population, if that cannot be serviced by a democratic government, then the security of the region is at risk. And I think this is a new complexity. We're in uncharted waters right now. And this is why, swinging back to something someone said earlier, we really need to be in this boat together, and we're really not. It's everyone for everyone's sake. The response to the COVID, the response to the threats to democratic institutions, and the dismissal of the multilateral institutions that are trying to struggle to collaborate with the democratic governments. So I guess I'm not painting a very rosy picture right now. And the question would be, how do we come out of this? Like Juan was saying earlier, what about a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? No one's thinking beyond next week or next day. And we really need to be able to step back and have some discussions among countries, among governments about the future in this, what's going to be a new normal that we don't even understand what it is yet. So democracy at risk, a pandemic in the region, authoritarian tendencies, these are the trends right now that we need to consider in this hemispheric security conference.
Thank you, Jenny. Now I want to turn to Juan here to talk about the non-democratic state of Cuba, right? So there are reports out, at least the reports that they're reporting, of 1,900 cases and about 80 deaths of COVID. It's very difficult for a lot of folks. It's a hot topic here in Miami, right? How can we trust these numbers, and how do we look at Cuba in terms of their influence and impact on the broader Central America and Caribbean region?
That's a great question. I mean, it's not just Cuba. I mean, I think there are certain states in the United States that are hiding the numbers. I'm not going to name any, but look, I don't believe the numbers in Cuba. I don't believe the numbers in Brazil. I don't believe the numbers in Mexico. I mean, but the challenge specifically to Cuba is the same one in China, is that when you control and censor information, you leave yourself unprepared to develop the proper response to such a global pandemic and assess the scale of the damage. So I think this is something that is going to have a major impact on Cuba, even though it's closed off largely from the United States. There has been a lot of travel from other parts of the world. It's going to be disastrous. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, and I'm definitely not a pandemic disease specialist, but when you see pictures of mass graves in cities like Sao Paulo, I ask myself, how many bodies are going to be hidden in Nicaragua? How many bodies are going to be hidden in the Northern Triangle? How many bodies are going to be in mass graves in places like Cuba? And I think that all said and told, the concerning thing here is that in places not just like Cuba, but El Salvador is using emergency or autocratic methods to control this pandemic is going to lead to a massive increase in human rights abuses. So the response to all this, whether it's in Cuba or Haiti, Jamaica, or Honduras, a lot of it has to be leadership and example. And I think that's an area where the United States can really play a clear role in actually making sure that the anti-corruption and the pro-human rights agenda does not go on the back burner just because we're literally fighting for our lives against the coronavirus.
Jenny, you wanted to jump back in there.
Yes, I want to mention the calendar of elections. And one of the challenges as we look toward the future is a calendar of national elections. Honduras, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Bolivia is on hold. The impact of the virus, and we don't know how long this virus is going to last, not in the United States, not in the hemisphere, but how will there be a safe way to hold national elections during a pandemic? And if elections are postponed, as they were in Bolivia, then for how long? And what does that mean in terms of the authoritarian streak and the inclination for governments to say, we can't hold elections yet because it's not safe. And actually, it's probably not safe. But then what happens, and what are the agreements that have to be entered into across parties and the government to deal with any kind of postponing of elections? So political participation, anything that it involves a group, is one concern. Another is disinformation. And there, in a democracy, the need for a freedom of the press, and in some of these situations in El Salvador, and when we see, and in Nicaragua, we see a control of the press. So there is an undermining of democracy when there is no transparency in the information, and now information about a pandemic. So two forthcoming risks in the short and medium term involve looking at how elections may be held and what are the consequences if governments in power decide that they can't hold the elections.
Thank you, Jenny. I want to turn over to Jacqueline on that point and the larger discussion. Obviously, Haiti has had a new spur of protest. There is also scheduled elections, right, in Guyana, Suriname, St. Kitts, or Guyana had their election, but you have Suriname and St. Kitts also looking at holding their elections. And much of this is spurring protest around these countries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I also wanted to go back first to something Juan said, which will also lead into discussion. You talk about the United States taking a leadership role, but today in this region, no one feels that the United States is taking a leadership role. When, the US is using, or the Trump administration is using the Defense Production Act to ensure that PPEs are not getting to the Cayman Islands, Barbados, we had the Bahamas, we had Jamaica. These are serious issues. And so guess what happened? Countries are turning to China to buy their PPEs and other equipment to fight COVID. And so that is something that needs to be thought about, and we need to see how that is going to play out. And that brings us into the issue of elections in terms of if the United States is not taking a leadership role, or countries do not feel that the US is there to assist them during one of the biggest pandemic that they faced since the Spanish flu, what role or credibility is the US going to have to step in to an electoral crisis that will most likely happen this year in respect to the elections that we're seeing that are scheduled? And I think Jenny raises a very important point, and I don't even know the answer. How do you hold an election in the middle of a pandemic? Suriname is going to at least give us some sort of answer. They claim that they've only had 11 COVID deaths, and I don't know if it's so much of hiding the numbers or if it's been a lack of testing, not having enough tests, not having enough people to respond to the tests. And so do we really have a clear view of how this pandemic is playing out in these countries? And that to me is very dangerous when you're thinking about these elections, because there's an over-reliance in terms of the mask. Is it really going to protect all of us? In Haiti, the country has been in crisis. It's always been in crisis, but what we've seen in the last 3 years since President Jovenel Moise has come to power is you've seen protests after protests after protests. There's a debate right now in the country in terms of whether his term ends next year or whether it ends 2 years from now. But the opposition is saying, COVID or no COVID, we are going to take the streets. This is happening while this pandemic is raging through that country. Currently, President Moise is ruling by decree. There is no parliament. Before COVID, the US was putting a lot of pressure on him to have elections. He's got a new electoral system. People don't have the cards. So we're also looking at voter disenfranchised. I mean, you're looking at a mess in that country. And of course, everybody's looking at Guyana. Its decision not to allow the Carter Center to come down and to participate in the recount. How is that recount going to be accepted? At the end of the day, CARICOM is there. There's so many unknowns. And as Jenny says, we are in uncharted territories given this health crisis right now. And how long can you postpone an election? And can you even get an agreement with the opposition in any of these countries to say, hey, let's put this on hold?
Jacqueline, if I can go back to you very quickly here as a follow-up, you mentioned about the absence of U.S. Leadership in the Caribbean and the region at large. And we've gotten a few questions with regard to other external state actors looking at Russia and places like Nicaragua and Cuba, but also China increasing their presence in the Caribbean, working also a lot of Chinese former Chinese residents taking up citizenship by investment through the Citizens by Investment programs. Can you talk a little bit about how China and Russia are increasing their influence in the absence of U.S. leadership?
Well, interesting. When I was on that visit I was embedded with Admiral Fowler last year when we made the Caribbean tour. We went to Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and we went to Haiti. And very much part of the narrative of that visit was the threat that Russia and China posed in the Caribbean. They quoted some figures in terms of weapons that China had sold, Venezuela. If we recall last year, you had the Dominican Republic, which shocked a lot of people when it dumped Taiwan and it went to China. But what I have been noticing and what's interesting is that the US put a lot of energy in saying to these Caribbean and Central American, countries, don't go to China. We're here for you. We are concerned about this. And when we see how it has responded in respect to the COVID and the need for equipment, whether it's testing, it's ventilators, what are you doing? You're basically forcing these countries to turn to China to make their purchases, and that's what they are doing. I will be very interested to see what the researchers find at the end of this in terms of how much money China has made out of this region as it's tried to respond to COVID-19. In terms of cybersecurity, the issue also came up. Fowler raised that in Jamaica in respect to Russia and China. I mean, the Jamaicans basically said to him, listen, we know who our friends are and we know who our enemies are. Ironically, when he was down there, Jamaican Prime Minister Holness was on an official state visit to China.
Wow. Jennie, a lot of questions here about Russia and Nicaragua. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yes, I was just scrolling through the questions that are fascinating. And that Nicaragua needs friends. Nicaragua needs friends. Nicaragua has gotten weapons from Russia and looking to solidify that economic relationship is a priority, I think, for Nicaragua right now. And the concern for Russia, interestingly enough, Russia is the player in Nicaragua, not China, because Nicaragua maintains its relationship with Taiwan. So the external actors that are important certainly include Russia in Nicaragua right now.
Thank you, Jennie. Juan, you brought up this increase of external state actors as one of those additional pillars that we should be looking at. El Salvador recently recognized the One China policy, and in exchange, China is doing or expected to do a large number of investments in Salvadoran infrastructure. What are your thoughts on the Chinese and Russian engagements in the region?
Well, on China specifically, if you look at just the global competition that's taking place between the United States and China, it's a three-pronged competition. There's one for technological dominance, issues like the future of war. In 10 to 15 years, wars are going to be fought in space, and China is winning that race. You're not going to necessarily need aircraft carriers where the future of war is going. The other one is one for economic dominance, that's one where you're seeing the One Belt, One Road initiative being a very effective tactic for China, not just in Asia and in Europe, but also in Latin America. And then the last one is I think one for the political model, where if you look at Xi Jinping's speech to the party last year, he basically said, I don't remember the quote exactly, but saying that China's economic model and political model is better than the United States. So countries of the region, I think, are taking note, particularly autocrats. And you have to look no farther than Venezuela, where traditionally in Latin America, you're seeing economic crises and political disruptions as a catalyst for change. The Chinese economy and the Russians are essentially playing a veto player role in that process by holding up Venezuela. And so the transition in Venezuela will not happen until China and Russia come to the table and have a conversation. But in some ways, what Russia is doing is just as concerning, even though it's not the largesse that it's not a company with the largesse that comes with China. What Russia is doing in Latin America is to try to counterbalance what the United States is doing closer to Russia. They don't care about Latin America at all. And they initially started to try to get into Latin America through Venezuela. They realized they reached a dead end in Venezuela, and they've started to, play a greater role in Nicaragua. You're starting to see, when I was in my last year in the administration, that the Russians were also doing counter-narcotics training. And I would hate to see what kind of training they were actually offering, but they're trying to offer alternatives. They're selling weapons without any sort of protocols or conditionality associated with it. When the United States provides that sort of support, there are definitely strings attached, and it comes also with a level of cooperation to increase capabilities. For Russia, it's all about the United States, and they don't care about the second order effects of that influence. And that's something that should concern the region. It should concern human rights and democracy advocates.
Richard, you wanted to jump in on this, but I also wanted to use the opportunity to transition towards a larger migration discussion. Obviously, Trinidad and Tobago has received a large number of Venezuelans over the past few years. Can you talk about that as well?
Sure. I have to again agree with Jacqueline in the context of the question of leadership. The commonality of values, global values, human rights values, has to be tied to the nature of situational realities that considers issues like vulnerabilities and risks. And in that context, I think it's important as we begin to discuss the intent of international partners in terms of their investments in the region and what their long-term agendas are. For those who are at risk and are vulnerable, there's a question of what type of leadership is going to ensure the commonality of values beyond what we say, but the fact that we consider the vulnerabilities of those who may not necessarily be able to operate in the same global political economies as the way other developed countries are able to. So I think we are going to have to put in the middle there as a foundational principle, the question of vulnerabilities. And that ties particularly into issues like citizen by investment programs. And to the extent that for countries that their main security threat is the very state or survivability of their economies, if we are asking to prescribe to certain values of democracy and the question of the security of the region and the checks and balances that goes into, and the vetting that goes into ensuring that persons who are issued with passports to operate within the region are safe for the region, then the question of the vulnerabilities of the economies that are inviting persons to invest in the region is going to have to be factored into the whole question of leadership in the region and the hemisphere as a whole. And then the question of migration. Yes, Trinidad and Tobago is on record as having done something that we consider to be quite novel. We have registered over 16,000 Venezuelan migrants to our countries, affording them the opportunities with work permits and the opportunity to work and earn a living. And that essentially was informed by the perspective that not all migrants, in fact, the majority of migrants are not necessarily a drain on a host country's economy. Many of the migrants that come to Trinidad and Tobago, they are very productive people who want to work and to be able to earn their keep in a country in order to be able to, some instances, send remittances back to their families at home and so on. So that has been a very successful model for us because we've been able to formalize their integration into our economies and allow a win-win situation in which they are afforded the opportunities to work and to operate with a certain measure of dignity in a foreign country, and at the same time contribute to the labor force development in a country like Trinidad and Tobago.
Jacqueline, I want to turn to you here because you mentioned the potential threat of Haitians potentially getting on boats heading towards the United States. Can we span that out and look at the potential post-COVID because of the economic impacts of migration towards the United States coming from the Caribbean?
Clearly, look, the U.S., what we've seen in recent years is that the U.S. has been very strong in terms of its enforcement in the Florida Straits. Haitians, while they continue to make their way to the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, we have seen a change in the migration. A lot of them made their way to Brazil after the 2010 earthquake. And then from Brazil, they eventually worked their way up to the US-Mexico border. When we're looking at the number of deportations that are happening now, it's a lot of those people who basically, walked for months and made their way from Brazil and Chile and then to Mexico, and then they applied for asylum in the US, and now you see that they've lost those claims and they are being sent back to Haiti. That's been the migration trend. But we haven't seen the flotillas like we saw in the past, in the 90s and in the 80s. Is that a possibility? Yes, it could be. I mean, what's interesting is that the US Embassy in recent months have started to run these PSAs in Creole on the radio, telling people how dangerous these migrations are. But I've been covering, the migration issue out of Haiti for, over a decade now. And when I go and I talk to somebody who was on a boat and almost died, and other people died, the response is the same. We're already the walking dead. So we might as well, if we died trying, at least we tried. The economic situation in Haiti was desperate before COVID. 4 million Haitians were facing food insecurity, even famine. And the World Health Organization through PAHO has been sounding the alarm and says in the next couple of weeks, you can expect 55,000 Haitian migrants to cross the closed border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We've already seen over 26,000 since the outbreak began. And so this is an issue. Even Jamaica is keeping a close eye in terms of that migration in the Caribbean. And while we've talked a lot in terms of Haiti, I think it's relevant also, for Cuba. It's definitely relevant for Venezuela. I mean, this issue of migration and the impact of COVID is going to be a huge security threat, because again, back to my original point is that if we flatten the curve and our neighbor hasn't flattened the curve, what does that mean for all of the effort that we've done?
Thank you, Jackie. I do want to turn over to Juan here. Juan, you worked on the plan of the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, a plan that was pushed out to be able to curb Central American migration towards the United States. We do know that that plan has been defunded, but what do we anticipate now with COVID? There was a report recently that remittances were at an all-time low to Central America, something that they really rely on. Can we anticipate a big push of migration towards the United States coming from the Northern Triangle?
Yes. Well, I mean, first of all, I think in Haiti, it's around August that you see these massive migration flows, and they're usually driven by politics, as Jacqueline was saying. So I think in a presidential election here in the United States, you're going to see two massive flows of migration coming to the United States. And what's concerning about that is that the United States does not actually have a mass migration policy. If you look at U.S. immigration policy in general, it's really kind of designed around the Second World War, and it's to bring in refugees from Europe after the Second World War. But we don't really have a good migration or immigration policy to address these flows coming from our own region. So we could face a situation where our borders are completely overwhelmed starting in August. And then as summer starts cooling down, you'll see a surge in migration coming from the Northern Triangle countries. But that's not all. You're I think also going to see increased migration from Africa. You may see also Cuban migration. We had that scenario during the final year that I was in the administration, and it was, I'm going to tell you, it was all consuming. the White House, the entirety of the State Department was consumed with trying to address, the Department of Homeland Security was consumed with trying to address the situation here. So I think the way to address this is to head it off at the path. I know it's probably not politically expedient to say that the United States should be thinking now about trying to prevent or address the international, the impact of the coronavirus abroad. I think that focusing our assistance on just migration flows is a mistake. As we've discussed here, security threats here are much broader than just migration, which I would characterize as a leading indicator of a lack of institutionality, a lack of a presence of the state, lack of an access to justice, economic opportunity, widespread corruption, and that applies to the entire hemisphere. How does the United States address this? And I'll tell you, Joe Biden, when he went down to Guatemala the first time in June 2014, he said that this conversation, much like in Plan Colombia, starts with political will and political commitment by the countries of the region. So I would be inspired to see some transcendental leaders in the region actually finding common cause on very ambitious goals to move very quickly back from the brink. I think I got to recognize the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago as one of, I think, one of the regional leaders. And the RSS is, of course, headquartered in Trinidad and Tobago. This is, Crowley, the Prime Minister is somebody who can lead in the Caribbean and partner with the United States. In Central America, partnering with countries like Costa Rica, and the challenging thing is in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, you have at this point uneven leadership. And in one country, Honduras, you have an unindicted co-conspirator as the president of the country. It makes cooperation a very challenging task.
Yeah, I want to get to some of these questions. Obviously, we're getting a lot of questions. It's a great panel so far. I want to throw out a broad question that will go to Jennie, Richard, and Jacqueline. We have seen there's questions related to foreign fighters and terrorists in the region. There's been no question that El Salvador has taken a very heavy-handed approach more recently against the gangs, obviously calling them terrorists. So Jennie, I'd love your take there. Jacqueline, if you can talk about, there's a question regarding Phantom 509 in Haiti and what the role of them in the region. And Richard, if you could talk about some of the things that you all did with regard to Daesh. Obviously, the highest number per capita of foreign fighters leaving to Syria came from Trinidad and Tobago. So Jennie, if we can start with you.
Well, it's uneven in terms of the fighters. I saw a question on the list that said, why aren't there freedom fighters in Nicaragua right now? Where's the Contra, or where's the old Contra, or the new Contra? Well, the Contra has, the old Contra is actually participating in the political parties. And the other thing has to do with arms. Who funds foreign fighters in countries in Central America now? And do they? And or are they? Or where are the arms? Who has them? And where's the control? So in terms of foreign fighters, no. But the gangs, yes, that's another subject in terms of the instability and the threat to the rule of law and criminal organizations. So there's sort of instead of foreign mercenaries, it's indigenous criminal organizations, and I think that's the threat.
Jacqueline?
Well, was it last year we saw some U.S. mercenaries in Haiti, and then the State Department just swiped them out of the country without them even seeing a Haitian judge. And then they came to Miami and they basically walked free. That sent shockwaves into the country. And it goes back to the issue of leadership. I mean, today we have an administration in the U.S. That went from being sort of heavy-handed in terms of Haiti's politics and policies to basically being absent. And when you look at Phantom 509, I mean, what this is a police force that the United States and the United Nations built, trained, paid for, and that today it is imploding. And within that force, you have bad cops who were supposedly fired, but never really fired because that was the judge of the job of the Justice Ministry. You have police officers who are underpaid, who cannot really survive, and no one has really addressed that issue. It's a leadership problem in terms of Haiti. It's a leadership problem in terms of the international community. And today what we are watching is that we're going back in time. And I think that everybody just sort of wants to ignore it and think that it's going to go away. But clearly what they have shown is the ability to bring a government, I mean, not necessarily all the way to its knees, but they're going around and they're blowing up cars that belong to the ministry. They're putting their demands and the government is responding. If this issue is not addressed in a different kind of way, then I think that you can kiss the Haitian police force goodbye. And we will be right back to where we were in 2004 and needing some sort of international intervention.
That is a scary, scary thought. Richard, can we talk about Daesh? Have we seen a resurgence of foreign fighters, or has this been calmed down?
Randy, it has been calmed down, and a lot of it had to do with early and decisive work done by the government of Trinidad and Tobago to address this issue. You are right. We have had per capita, perhaps the largest foreign terrorist fighters, or persons who have left Trinidad and Tobago to go and fight in Syria. And that resulted in December 2017, the establishment of a national committee to roll out a national counterterrorism strategy to address this issue. I sat on that committee. I do sit on the committee. And the national counterterrorism strategy approached it both from a preventative as well as a counter-narrative, a countering perspective. And from the preventative side, we did a lot of work in trying to understand what were some of the drivers at the community level that resulted in persons, young people, moving towards that radicalized position to want to go to fight in conflict zones. And a huge part of it was really an understanding the nature of governance itself in terms of how we disseminate goods and services from central governments to the community level to win the battle of legitimacy against actors in the communities who are operating in informal economies that were competing against the state for legitimacy in terms of the delivery of goods and services at the community level. And as we all understand, the efficiency and effectiveness of the delivery of goods and services at the community level feeds into the very collective identity of the communities. And that's where the convergence between gang and criminality and radicalization converged in our situation, to which we had to address from a strong emphasis on de-radicalization, a strong emphasis on approaching a counter-communicative narrative to ensure that we build into our governance and public policy framework a commitment to patriotism and the fact that in a country, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious community like society like Trinidad and Tobago, there is an opportunity for everyone to practice their own religions in the way that they see fit in a peaceful manner. The other side of it is the strength of our cooperation and collaboration with our international partners. The government of the United States of America, and particularly the United Kingdom, we have worked in many ways to ensure that we join the international intelligence community to be able to anticipate the return of foreign terrorist fighters to our country and build into our national architecture a framework of de-radicalization and rehabilitation for persons who are so inclined back into the communities to be productive members of the society and contribute in a peaceful way. So our success story has not been based purely on our national efforts. It has been regional and it has been interregional to ensure that we get to where we have gotten to, but we have not taken our hands off of the fight. We understand that with the COVID-19, that there are opportunistic actors who are attempting to optimize what they perceive to be a preoccupation with COVID-19 as far as our national security architectures are concerned. And that's the simultaneous engagement that we think and we prescribe should be the way moving forward.
Juan, you wanted to get in on this conversation?
I just wanted to, kind of foot stomp the approach that Trinidad and Tobago has taken to foreign terrorist fighters. I had the opportunity when Ambassador John Estrada was down there when this conversation started. And again, this goes back to the issue of political will, where Trinidad and Tobago's leadership took a methodical approach to this challenge. They started by they realized they did not have a legal infrastructure to address return fighters. Of course, there's the punitive side, but I got to recognize in particularly the community and preventive side, where there was a lot of outreach to community and religious leaders to recognize the characteristics of radicalization and self-radicalization. And they took it seriously, and they were very active with support of the United States. I actually think that is a model that that can be replicated in other places, whether or not it has to do with foreign terrorist fighters. Is taking a very, you have a punitive, a judicial, and a preventative community-based approach. In Central America, the best, I think, comparison would be place-based strategies, where you don't wait until people join gangs. You actually look at creating opportunities for at-risk youth that allow them to, in El Salvador, a child either in some situations either leaves the country or joins a gang. And by having what we did in cities like Los Angeles and Chicago, by creating community groups, empowering community leaders to prevent that sort of radicalization, which I think joining gangs is also a form of radicalization, is key. So I think TNT is a model to be replicated in other parts of Central America and the Caribbean.
Jennie, I want to put it here before we go to final remarks. I wanted to get your thoughts on, there's questions regarding transnational criminal organizations, gangs, and the impacts that COVID might be having on their ability to conduct their business as usual. What do you anticipate is going to occur now? Will there be an opportunity to restructure and strengthen or reorganize their efforts towards illicit activities in the region?
I'll transition into your part with a tagline on Juan, because Honduras had a phenomenal, and El Salvador did too. USAID supported exactly what you're talking about, and all of those funds have been cut, and those programs have just died on the vine. And if there was an opportunity to try to redirect youth from gangs, that was it. And we've lost really almost a handful of years of projects there. So with that in mind, I would like to say that the transnational criminal organizations are just like the drug trafficking organizations of the 80s and 90s. They're a step ahead. They're a step ahead, and they're a step ahead with resources, planning, and organization. And so this is ripe opportunity for them to take advantage of weak institutions, the undermining of the rule of law. And I think this will be, COVID will be a bonus to the criminal organizations that are able to flourish while governments are floundering in the response to COVID.
Thank you for that, Jennie. Now we're running out of time, so I want to ask each of the panelists to provide some last-minute thoughts. Imagine yourself, it's January 2021, and you're either advising President Trump's second term or advising President Biden. What is the advice? What is the security trends that you would recommend that the next administration, whoever it is looking at in Caribbean and Central America? So I'll start with you, Richard.
Randy, I have to end where I began. The interrelation and interconnection between transnational organized crime, climate change, and COVID-19 has to be understood in prescriptions in terms of the way we move forward. And the relationship between these three, I call descriptive pillars of defense and security, is very dynamic and multi-directional, so that the nature of our simultaneous engagement on these three salient descriptive pillars is going to have to inform the way we move forward. There cannot be an approach to COVID-19 without the implications for climate change, when the national emergency and the regional emergency agencies are going to be duly tasked in that regard. And then, of course, the opportunistic actors of transnational organized crime are indeed looking forward, because the fact of the matter is, what COVID-19 has demonstrated is the fragility in some of our regional and multilateral arrangements to treat with the complexity of crime and criminality globally and certainly hemispherically. So I think the simultaneous engagement on those three salient descriptive pillars should be a start in terms of any administration, with an understanding that vulnerability, for one, means vulnerability for all.
Thank you, Richard. Jacqueline.
I'm going to second, what Richard said, and it reminds me of something that UN Secretary General Guterres said recently, that basically, the world is as strong as its weakest health system. And, and again, all of the security challenges that we had before COVID, they are there, and now they are even more pertinent because of COVID. Whether it's been a Democratic, administration in the United States or Republican, the Caribbean has always talked about the fact that they are the third border, but they are ignored. And my advice to whoever is in that White House is that it is time to engage in this region, because the security in the United States, all of the issues that are being dealt with in terms of immigration, all of that is dependent on what happens on that third border in the Caribbean. And if the US does not start engaging, it is going to have a crisis, not in its backyard, but in its front yard.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Juan.
So recognizing that the two most rare commodities in a presidential, in a White House are the president's time and political capital, I think it is important for the president of the United States to invest both of those in North America, Central America, and the Caribbean when it comes to this much broader definition of security that includes energy security, food security, climate security, humanitarian assistance and disaster preparedness, and a global pandemic response. We have to recognize that security threats are not just law enforcement challenges. We've seen that high intensity law enforcement operations give you tactical victories, but that they are not durable in the absence of strong rule of law institutions and economic development. So what the United States, I think, needs to do is, and where my preferences lie here, but is a Marshall Plan for the region that really looks at investing the tools and the senior engagement of government like we do in the Middle East. I would say that, not being a Middle East expert, that I think we would get a lot more money out of the $1 trillion spent by the United States in Afghanistan. I think we'd get a lot more mileage out of it in Latin America, and it would be something that would help address the threats to democracy. It would help push back on extra regional actors that are trying to, I think, undermine the foundations that have actually maintained this as a democratic hemisphere for so long. And I think it needs to be done very, very early on and aggressively for it to have an impact. Again, as Jacqueline said very well, the security and prosperity of Central America and the Caribbean have very direct and immediate impacts of that on the national security of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Jennie.
The word that came to my mind was trust. We began this conference with Admiral Fowler talking about partnerships. And he was very, very eloquent about the partnerships that he works with and that we work with. But do our partners trust us right now? And do we trust our partners? And so I would ask that Jacqueline's word engagement, talk about security, Juan is also talking about the future. We need to recover the trust of our partners, invest in a relationship, a multilateral relationship, and go forward together and not independent cowboys all by ourselves.
Richard, Jacqueline, Juan, Jennie, thank you so much for an excellent panel. I wish we can go for another hour or so. Unfortunately, we can't, but we'll have to bring this back up at a later time. Thank you all for joining us. I'm turning it over to the director, my good friend, Brian Fonseca.
Excellent. Thank you, Randy. Excellent discussion among truly an exceptional group of thought leaders. And excellent leadership by you in bringing this panel together. I thought that the dialogue was phenomenal. We had over 300 live with us this morning and more on social media. And so it's a testament to the importance of discussing security in the context of the Caribbean and Central America. Ladies and gentlemen, before we close, I want to cede the floor to my friend and mentor, the great Frank Mora, for just a few words as we wrap up the 5th annual Hemispheric Security Conference. Dr. Mora.
Thank you so much, Brian. I also want to echo what you just said about this panel. This is really fantastic. I learned a lot. Randy, excellent job moderating. So as we close, let me just say a few things about the conference. One, Brian, I want to thank you for the partnership, for the great work that your team and my team have done to put this together. Under some challenging circumstances, I think we more than just pulled it off. We had over 1,400 people registered for this conference. We had a reach that was, I think, incredible, and a lot of it had to do with you and your team and my team and the Stephen J. Green School of Public and International Affairs. So thank you for that. Second, in light of that, I want to sort of emphasize that what this conference has done is what we try to do almost every day at FIU, at LAC, and at the Gordon Institute, which is to leverage the deep intellectual bench that we have, the students that we have, to talk about not just academic and theoretical issues, which we do and we do very well, but how we leverage that to have an impact in our community, broadly defined, not just in Miami, not just in the United States, but in the hemisphere. And this conference, I think, epitomizes what we try to do every day. How do we impact policy? How do we bridge academia and policy, which over the last few years has been frayed? And I think it's important that we try to reassert that bridge because we have a lot to learn from each other. So we're having an impact. And Brian, finally, I want to take just 30 seconds before I turn it back to you to sort of just say or announce, I think many of you know that in a month's time, I will be stepping down as the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center. After 7 great, wonderful years of running the center, of sort of leading a team of folks who have been really exceptional and extraordinary. And I think we've done really great work in partnership with you, Brian, and with others. I will be going on sabbatical. I'll be going on professional leave. I'm not disappearing. I will still be at FIU, but I'll be working on a couple of other important critical projects. President Luis Guillermo Solis will be stepping in as interim director for the next year. Couldn't think of someone any better than to have President Solis, who is already at LAC, taking on the responsibility of director. So I wish him the best and I'll let him know that I'm here to support him. So with Brian, thank you again. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mora, for your leadership. And I just want to be clear for all of us, watching this. You are taking a time out. You're not leaving. You're not going anywhere. You're simply taking a slight pause to tackle some really important projects, but that you will be back here by the time we get to the 6th annual Hemispheric Security Conference. You may no longer be the director, but you will definitely be a vital part of the team. So I just want to be clear about that. I also want to echo your comments and give a shout out to Patti Sapero, Lindsay Dudley, Catherine Dagan, Rosie Montenegro, of course, our incoming LAC director, President Luis Guillermo Solis, Randy, and all of the others that contributed in pulling this together. We moved into uncharted territory here. I remember very early on, our first discussion was, what are we going to do? Do we postpone the conference? Do we cancel this year and come back next year? And I think collectively we realized how important, building this was and is to the discussion. And so we decided to charge on. And instead of thinking about postponing or canceling, we thought about innovating. And so for us, this was very much uncharted territory. How do we build a day-long dialogue in sort of a digestible form? And I think we quickly realized that there's no going back. That the approach we took this year allowed us to be far more accessible and engaging than we had in any of the previous 4 years. Outside of the face-to-face human interaction, we've been able to bridge the gap globally. As Frank pointed out, we've had over 1,400 register, many more on social media from more than 30 countries around the world. You can't do that in a physical gathering. And so I think that our proof of concept has worked exceptionally well. And I look forward to doing this again next year in same form, maybe even innovate on top of this a little bit more as well. But the most important thing is that we made this a hemispheric wide discussion. oftentimes when we've had this gathering and other gatherings like it, it's usually the same voices in the same room. And it's often isolated geographically. And it doesn't really feel hemispheric wide. This one felt more hemispheric wide than at any other point. And I think that's what's on the horizon for us. And so, again, want to commend everyone that helped bring this together. Now, at the same time, this is not a 1-week discussion, right? This is a 365-day discussion. Security is something that remains vital in our work. And so I want to encourage you, those of you that are still on the line with us, to keep the conversation going, keep the dialogue going, whether that's on social media or reaching out to me and others that have been a part of this to continue the discussion virtually. I think that's something we have to continue to strive towards. And so, connect with us on social media. We'll connect with you on social media. Send us messages. We're already thinking about how we draw a thread between this year and as we move into next year, continuing to keep the dialogue going. And so with that, that's a wrap. This concludes the 5th annual Hemispheric Security Conference at Florida International University. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue and seeing you all again shortly. So thanks. Have a great week and a great rest of 2020.